Russia crossed Ukraine's border and brought in soldiers in, and US President Biden issued the first economic sanctions from the US against Russia, but decided not to send their troops. In the current situation, where unpredictable things continue to happen, today we will look into Ukraine and other related events. At the heart of the current Ukraine crisis is the NATO. The NATO is a military alliance created by the United States in 1949 at the early days of the Cold War to prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union, including the United States and other major European countries. And Ukraine wanted to join NATO and belong with that to the pro-Western camp, not to pro-Russia. But Russia didn't like this. One of the reasons Russia is obsessed with Ukraine is because of its very important historical beacons. Ukraine is an independent country after the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, and both of these countries' roots are the Principality of Kiev. Putin and some Russians want to regain the glory of the former Soviet Union. Their dream is to rebuild the past great empire connecting Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia. And especially Ukraine, located between Europe and Russia, has long been a strategic hub. When Napoleon extradited Russia and when the Nazis invaded Russia during World War II, they passed through Ukraine. And NATO promised to accept Ukraine as a member in 2008, but didn't say exactly at which time they would be able to join. And Putin, who thinks Ukraine is under the influence of Russia, was calling for Ukraine's withdrawal of its pledge to join the NATO and the suspension of NATO's expansion to the east. In the past, NATO promised not to expand its power to the east to where Russia is. But Russia is angry because they didn't keep this, and NATO on the other hand argues that it has never made such promise. To find out the background of this promise that Russia and NATO claim in different ways, we need to check the past from the Cold War. In 1955, 6 years after the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union formed a military alliance with some Eastern European countries against NATO, and that was the WTO. In this way, the Cold War between NATO and the WTO continued, and a few years later in 1989, a symbol of the East-West Cold War, the Berlin Wall fell. The following year in 1990, both East and West Germany and 4 countries, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France gathered to negotiate Germany's unification issue. And here, in the process of negotiating with the Soviet Union, the Western countries did make the promise that the NATO will no longer expand to the east. In 1991, when the Soviet Union was disbanded and the Cold War ended, the WTO, a Soviet military alliance, was also disbanded. And then the former Soviet countries that joined the WTO slowly joined into NATO. So unlike the former promise, NATO continued to expand to the east. Starting with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic in 1999, 3 Baltic countries, Romania and Bulgaria, became also NATO members in 2004. That's why Putin was angry and stated that he can no longer tolerate the expansion of NATO and its growing power to the east. Despite Putin's anger, however, NATO continued to increase its power and grew into a super large force involving 30 countries. And Ukraine was the country that wanted to become the 31st NATO member. With that, Putin got very angry because NATO continued to expand its power to the east, ignoring its promise, and even the Ukraine, which is located right next to Russia, wanted to join NATO. However, at the time of the past negotiations, the United States and NATO have never formally committed to banning other countries from joining NATO. Of course, it was mentioned by the leaders of the West Germany and the United States, and it was also true that they sought an understanding of the Soviet Union through this. But it was only a non-binding verbal promise. From NATO's point of view, they have never officially promised to voluntarily reject countries that want to become a member. This is how NATO's official position can be summarized. What a leader personally promises cannot replace the alliance agreement or the official treaty of the NATO. and that's why Russia and NATO convince each other that the other is in the wrong. Next, about the actual situation in Ukraine. Russia, which dreams of hegemony in the old Soviet era, has already invaded Ukraine and dominated the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula, which bounds to south of Ukraine, is very important strategic point for Russia because it is possible to enter the ocean through the Mediterranean Sea. In 1992, Russia and Ukraine collided over the Crimean Peninsula. There is a port city called Sebastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, and the problem was that the Russian Black Sea Fleet was stationed there. The Black Sea Fleet is one of Russia's four largest fleets in service since the Soviet Union. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent state, so for a long time Russia and Ukraine fought over the control of the Black Sea Fleet. At the time, Russia started to pressure on Ukraine like cutting out the gas supply. Russia has a strong reason to be obsessed with the Black Sea Fleet. Because if Russia had the jurisdiction over the Black Sea Fleet, it could legally station Russian troops on Ukrainian land, and that is an easy way to suppress Ukraine. Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world, inheriting the nuclear weapons that the former Soviet Union had. But at the same time, they faced a serious security crisis due to Russia and made a very important decision. In 1994, Ukraine signed a Budapest Memorandum with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Ukraine signed a memorandum stating that it would give up on nuclear weapons with the condition of security and economic support. Ukraine was forced to choose denuclearization because of the pressure from the US and Russia from both sides, fearing to face separate disadvantages if they don't sign the contract. But only 20 years later, this promise of security was shattered, because in 2014, Russia sent troops to attack the Crimean Peninsula. And next is the background of the Crimean crisis. The Ukraine had a long conflict between pro-Russian forces in the east and anti-Russian forces in the west over the Dnieper River. However, in 2008, Ukraine fell into a state bankruptcy crisis due to the world economic crisis. And in 2013, Ukraine's economy continued to deteriorate, and at this time they faced the situation where they have to decide who to ask for economic help. The first forces ready to help them were the European Union, the IMF, and the second was Russia. At the time, pro-Russian President Yanukovych rejected help from the EU and decided to get it from Russia. And with that, the anger of the citizens exploded. Ukrainian citizens have long expressed dissatisfaction with the pervasive corruption of Yanukovych's government, and their displeasure came to a head when they saw the president aligning himself with Russia rather than the EU. As a result, angry citizens organized the large-scale protest, driving out their president. People wanted to discard the old Russian system and choose the European system to escape poverty. However, 3 months after the incident, a pro-Russian figure named Aksionov suddenly appeared and became the head of the Republic of Crimea, saying he would protect the pro-Russian Ukrainian residents. After that, he asked Putin for help to protect them, and Putin immediately attacked also occupied the Crimean Peninsula. Finally, in March 2014, the Crimean Peninsula was merged with Russia based on the result of the referendum on Crimea's status. While 63% of Crimeans were Russians, the result of Crimea's referendum showed that 95.9% supported Russia's return. In this way, Putin was able to advance his base camp into the Mediterranean Sea. Ukraine and other Western countries refused to admit the merger, saying Russian pressure was underfoot, but Putin ignored that. And when Russia occupied the Crimean Peninsula, pro-Russian groups in Ukraine also launched a separate independence movement, saying they would become independent too. The Ukrainian government defined them as rebels and declared a civil war, and this was the Donbas War in 2014. Donbas is a Russian border region in eastern Ukraine. While separatist rebels insisted on secession from Ukraine and becoming independent. Eventually, the Donbas War killed 14,000 people and caused more than 1.5 million war refugees. In the middle, the ceasefire agreement, the Minsk Agreement, was signed, but even that was not complied with, so the struggle is still ongoing. Ukraine accuses Russia of supporting separatist rebels in Donbas, and Russia says they never intervened. Earlier, I explained the situation between NATO and Russia surrounding Ukraine, but there are more serious problems in Ukraine. Ukrainian citizens fed up with all the government corruption have elected a comedian as a president, saying he's pure and new because he has no political experience. The problem, however, is that President Zelensky, who was elected with 73% of the vote, installed a large number of friends in key government positions. Ukrainian media Behus once reported that President Zelensky has transferred more than 30 government posts to his family and acquaintances in the entertainment industry. In fact, he appointed the former agency's screenwriter as a national security advisor and his agency's PD as a head of the national intelligence. Since Zelensky and his friends were tasked with protecting citizens from external threats, Ukraine has long been seen as a horror drama, not a comedy. Former Speaker of the Ukrainian House of Representatives spoke about the Zelensky resign. We ended up seeing a horror movie, not a comedy. None of that is funny. Europe relies on Russia for 40% of its natural gas supply, so it seems this situation as an emergency, fearing that Russia will cut off the gas supplies if a war breaks out. And the United States is in a difficult situation. They cannot allow Russia to take over Ukraine and pursue its imperial ambitions, but if things go wrong, Russia could ally with China. Actually, in January, after the United States warned Russia about the situation in Ukraine, Russia and China conducted a joint maritime training in Western Arabian waters. Many experts are giving different opinions on the current situation. There was even an analysis that all-out war between NATO, Russia, and the United States could lead to a World War III or nuclear war. As such, many expected it to be resolved diplomatically rather than militarily. Nevertheless, the situation has already worsened when Russia invaded Ukraine. What do you think about this situation? Thanks for watching. Be safe.